So Laura Menzies from Operations and Supply Chain Management is going to be talking to us about the importance of empathy and sustainability, another, very strong institutional initiative kind of that, we're all hoping to learn from today. So Laura, I hand over to you. Thank you. And thank you so much, Shirley.
Thank you, Joanna. Can you hear me, see everything okay? We good? Fantastic. So yeah, as Joanna said, I'm Dr. Laura Menzies and I'm a lecturer in Operations and Supply Chain Management with the Management School. And I wanted to talk to you today about my experience of embedding sustainability into a module. So rather than just covering it kind of in a week, how we embed it and how the importance of empathy really comes to light then. And that we created a sense of belonging within this in order to we used empathy to create a sense of belonging. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about our responsibility within the climate crisis, so our responsibility as educators. The first quote from Kerry Facer was that we have a responsibility to teach younger generations rather than being fearful, projecting our anxieties onto them and then expecting them to fix the world. Oof, did that hit hard when she said that, because I often do a week on sustainability and I kind of went back and had to reflect on, is that what I'm doing? Am I considering how they are actually seeing this? And also Paul Polman from Unilever talked a little bit about how we can be the voice of reason for the types of changes that we need to save our planet. There's a lot of misinformation that goes on and it can be very difficult to navigate that, and I'm going to straight up say that we are not going to be expected to have all the answers here, and that's why kind of having conversations with our students then becomes so important. So my role on this journey then, I did some carbon literacy training back in 2021, and I found this a completely transformative learning experience. It was 8 hours of training. It wasn't even that much time, but they talked to us about the science behind climate change, social equity and climate change, and they also focused on what we can do to act, both as individuals, but also within our sphere of influence. So within our own families and as educators, obviously, to our students as well. And what I took away from that is that future supply chain leaders on my supply chain management module, hopefully, I'm not delusional, I don't think that every single one of them is going to be a future supply chain leader, but a couple of them might, could really have a difference in reducing our emissions and kind of how we approach climate change, if I give them the right knowledge and also the right skills moving forward when they're learning about this content. The other thing that I found in doing this carbon literacy project is that I was experiencing that content as a learner for the first time. And so I really took away from it some of the ways in which they tried to reduce the feeling of hopelessness and kind of apathy, that kind of feeling of, well, what can little old me do? I'm just one person, by kind of giving you some practical advice about what you can do moving forward. And that was something that I really wanted to bring in to the learning experience with my students. So that brought me to teacher empathy, the degree to which we care about our students, respond to their emotions and think about responding compassionately to what we're trying to teach them and also how they're receiving that information. So within the module, we demonstrated that by really considering the student perspectives in the design of the module and also telling them that we were doing that. It felt very important to tell them that we were trying to take an empathetic approach to this, because that is how we tried to foster that sense of belonging within the classroom. We very honestly shared our own journeys in terms of our individual approaches to sustainability. So what we do and don't do as consumers, for example, we talked about quite a lot. And that was to emphasize the fact that this is a journey. It's not a case that we are suddenly going to be sustainable. Everyone is on that journey. So for example, a practical example, I am now eating a lot less meat. I'm not yet a vegetarian. I'm not yet a vegan. That might be the end goal, but we're working towards that. So trying to share those sorts of things. And we also really avoided trying to be too forceful when discussing this sort of thing, because we want to inspire change in our students, but without shaming those that haven't actually engaged with this kind of content yet. So some of our students very sustainability orientated in their mindset as consumers. Fantastic. We had a huge amount to learn from them. Other students hadn't engaged with this yet. So it was trying to be very open about the fact that we were all learning about this. So in terms of the module then, the things that we actually did, I think prior to doing the carbon literacy training, I probably would have amended the content and not necessarily considered the delivery approach and the skills that we were trying to give students. So that's how it opened my eyes to that. I've been delivering this module for 7 years. It's a final year module, optional final year module. So there's usually around 60 students on it. And in terms of amending the content, the first thing we did obviously was introduce the carbon literacy training. That provided the why. So we really covered the science behind climate change, social equity and climate change. But in terms of the what you can do to act, we focused that a lot more on what you could do if you were working in supply chain management, and what kind of business actions, what actions businesses can take. We looked at the examples used, so we made sure that we did more sustainable business examples. We introduced the SDGs, and we also talked about regenerative sustainability a little bit, so making sure that we're not just focusing on doing less bad, we're trying to focus on doing good. In terms of the skills development, we did a lot of systems thinking. Systems thinking is so important for sustainability because we have to broaden the perspective of the impact on our business or the impact on our individual lives. But it's also really important in supply chain management because the decisions that you make as a business will have an impact for your supply chain. So we did a lot more about that. We introduced more problem solving and also decision making, but decision making with imperfect information, because it's very difficult to get perfect information relating to sustainability. So how does that feel? What sort of things do we need to consider when we don't have perfect information? Who can we ask? Who can we talk to? And that was all discussed in conversation with our students. So we used a flipped classroom approach, and students knew that any time that they were face to face with us, whether it was in their seminars or in their tutorials, they were going to be expected to speak. They were going to be expected to discuss. Not every student, but that's how the format was going to be. I think that we were trying to be quite empathetic in the way that we did that as well, by enabling students to prepare for what we were going to ask them so that they'd had a chance to think about it. And we also brought in those individual actions to try and reduce hopelessness within this whole domain. So some reflections then. The link between individual behaviour and supply chain manager behaviour needs exploring more. I'm working this on the assumption that if I am more sustainability orientated as an individual, that is going to come into my behaviours in the workplace. But that doesn't seem to have been particularly well researched so far as I've been able to find. Although maybe I need to start looking outside of the business research and into psychology and things like that. The high level of interaction really fostered a sense of belonging where the students in attendance were very willing to share, and we saw that grow as we went through the module. So towards the end of the module, students were very willing to kind of bring up their viewpoints. We're not always going to be the expert when it comes to sustainability. Some of our students have a very strong focus on this. So my image of pea milk there, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of pea milk. Apparently it's a very sustainable milk alternative, something I'd not heard of. But it was really interesting then to feel that students were so willing to share about their own experiences, and intersectionality where students were talking about kind of their culture, their kind of income groups growing up a little bit. I wasn't pushing for this kind of conversation, but these are the viewpoints that they brought into that, and that provided really wonderful opportunities for discussion. Sometimes it was a little bit uncomfortable though, because it led to other students in the room realizing that they'd made some assumptions about people. But actually in the sustainability space, if we're not having some uncomfortable conversations, we're probably not pushing far enough. These are messy, complex problems with no clear solutions, so we want to engage in that a little bit more. And on my final slide, just some reflections from a couple of our students. I found myself thinking about the topics we talked about in my free time, which is what university should always be about. Probably one of the favourite comments that I've ever had from a student on a module. So it really worked well for this student to kind of go ahead and think about how they can make a difference. And I also had a comment from a student saying that they now want to pursue a career in supply chain management. So that could be my student, that could be my one student that goes out there and makes change in that environment. For the next steps, I want to explore the opportunity to offer carbon literacy training to more students, and also opportunities to follow up with students a little bit more as well. Thank you.
That was really interesting. Thanks, Laura. Sorry, I'm gonna jump in here, Joanna. Sorry.
Please do. Yeah, fantastic.
So you talk about changing your assessment structure. I'd be really interested to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
That would be really interesting.
So the change to the title of this module and the content of the module, it was a last minute put in the module spec quick, because otherwise we're not going to be able to do this after I did the carbon literacy training. So at that point we didn't change the assessment structure. So the assessment structure as it is 2 reports. We've now changed that for next year because students felt like we weren't able to ask them enough about the different elements that we were bringing into this. Obviously, we still need to assess them on the supply chain management content, but they wanted to explore a lot more. So next year we're actually using mini assessments. So we're having 4 assessments, but a presentation relating to the SDGs, an infographic around kind of a supply chain problem that can be addressed through some of this knowledge. There's a quantitative assessment in there as well, because some of the students complained that we weren't assessing them on a particular quantitative element, which I feel like next year's students are really going to hate them for. But hey, so we're bringing that in, and there is still a report as well. So we're testing them on a variety of skills and bringing that in there.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Laura.
No worries.
Does anybody else have any questions for Laura at all?
I was just going to say, John, Laura, obviously an optional module, but sounds like a fantastic module. Do you think it would work with a bigger cohort of students, or do you think sort of the small nature of it is one of the keys to how successful it's been?
It's interesting you say that, Nick, because next year we've got 120, so we have doubled the amount of students, so I'll let you know. In terms of things like the integration of the SDGs and that sort of thing, the integration of carbon literacy training, absolutely, you could do that on a core module to try and make sure that all of our students have access to that kind of information. But that kind of sharing, the openness, I think it does lend itself more to a smaller group. Students definitely shared more in their tutorials rather than in their seminars. They still had conversations in the seminars, but those kind of nuggets of kind of co-creation that happened, that was more in the tutorials, which were a group of 20 rather than 60.
Thanks.
No worries.
Fantastic. Well, does anybody have any final questions for any of our presenters today even? I'm loving the resonances between the things. Shirley, kind of, you had a question. If you could unmute, and I think
yes,
that's it.
It'd be a meeting without everyone. Anyway, no, but I wanted to raise it, to go back to that question that was raised around safe spaces, and just to kind of add a more to that, if I might. So I think the real, probably as I said, the framing of how positioning decolonization, something to talk about and giving people things to read and engage with. But yes, the breakout room, that provided the initial space to discuss. But with the breakout room, they also had the opportunity to provide Padlet feedback via the Padlet. So that's anonymous in the groups and outside of the group situation. So it didn't identify anybody, and they could feel free that they could share whatever they wanted to share in that space. We then created a theme, the group, the actual working project group, created a list of themes that came out of that feedback. And then we actually then provided another mechanism to come together and have discussions around those various themes, so that we could try to explore those more and pick them and try to understand how we might try to solve them. So I think because it wasn't about necessarily fingerprinting or any individual's name necessarily being assigned to it. It was just about that capacity to provide an anonymous environment where they could actually share freely what they felt and what they're concerned, and then we could talk about it. And then I think finally, I think the other thing that was really big for them was having an opportunity for ongoing dialogue in the session. So, and the conversations didn't just stop at the sessions. I think people who were perhaps more friendly with one person or another were then having those conversations with each other. And that in itself was meant that, you know, we were actually, people were working through their thoughts and about how they felt. And so all of that helps to build a more trusting and safer space, and where no one is actually feeling as though they're being judged necessarily. Doesn't mean that, you know, you feel comfortable with the thing that they say, but it's about understanding that people do say this, you know, we can address them together.
Fantastic. Well, I'm very aware of time. I'm loving the resonances between the different talks, and Shirley, obviously, kind of you've been working with staff, and Laura, you're talking about students, but that kind of idea of people on journeys at different stages on that journey. And I think kind of that's been some really valuable material. So largely, I'd just like to kind of thank Alison and Waf, Nicola, Shirley, and Laura for some fascinating lightning talks.